After 3.5 years, after massive amounts of fan campaigning, after countless rumors, and after dozens of tidbits from Zack Snyder himself, we finally have the infamous Snyder Cut of Justice League. Now, what most people are probably thinking, was it worth it? Was it worth all of the campaigning, all of the time, all of the energy, and all the extra money that was put into this movie to finish it? Well, in full confidence, I can say yes, I believe that the wait was worth it. So if you're not aware of why two versions of Justice League exist, I'll try to break it down a bit. In early 2017, Zack Snyder wrapped filming for the movie and they entered the post-production period. Soon after this, Zack Snyder's daughter tragically took her own life. And as any sane person would, Zack Snyder decided to step away from the movie in order to be with his family. Now, apparently throughout production, even while Zack Snyder was still involved, there were clashes between the creative team and executives at Warner Brothers about what they wanted this movie to look like. So after Snyder left, Warner Brothers executives just saw their opportunity and they took over the production. Only a few months from release, Warner Brothers hired Joss Whedon to step in and be in charge of massive reshoots. And these reshoots made a lot of drastic changes to the overall script in order to make the film more lighthearted, and it basically completely ruined Zack Snyder's original version for the movie. And because of all these changes and the reshoots, the final result was that awful dumpster fire of a movie that we got in theaters in 2017. And ever since then, fans have been demanding to see the original intended version of Justice League. Even some of the actors over the past few years have joined the release the Snyder Cut movement. And then finally, in early 2020, Zack Snyder himself announced that the Snyder Cut would officially be happening and that it was going to be released on HBO Max. So now that everyone is on the same page, I'm going to start talking about this movie in depth. And I guess I should also point out that from here on out, I'm going to be talking spoilers galore, so there's your warning. Even if you've seen the theatrical cut, there are still massive spoilers because there are big chunks of this movie that are completely different. Before I talk about the things that I really like about this movie, I'm going to talk about a lot of the problems it has because it still has some problems. The biggest difference between the theatrical and HBO Max versions is that this movie is 4 hours long. Now, did it need to be 4 hours long? Absolutely not. And the length is the biggest problem with this movie. I think most of the stuff that we saw could have been cut down to about 3 hours instead of 4, because I don't need to see constant slow-mo scenes. I don't need to see this weird scene of these Icelandic chicks singing about Aquaman that goes on for 3.5 minutes. And I really don't need to see a drawn-out scene of Barry saving Iris West from a car wreck. And I'm guessing that Zack Snyder took literally everything he filmed and just put it in this movie. And that is the biggest reason for why this movie is so long. And I actually just saw that apparently 10% of this movie is in slow-mo. That's 24 minutes of slow-mo in a 4-hour movie. He also includes several slow-mo sequences that have very weird music choices in the background, and it's really unnecessary to include these because it just slows the movie down for basically no reason. It happens 4 or 5 times throughout the movie, and I get that this is kind of his style, but honestly I just saw no reason to include dozens of slow-mo scenes. Now, believe it or not, all those complaints I just mentioned are completely minor when you look at the movie as a whole. As I said before, this movie is intended to be Snyder's complete vision for this movie, and regardless of how you feel about Man of Steel or Batman v Superman, there was some really cool DC content in this gigantic beast of a movie. The first thing that this movie does well is that it lays out the plot miles better than the theatrical cut. There are several scenes in this movie that are completely different from the theatrical cut, and there are scenes that aren't even in the theatrical cut at all, and it makes this movie look so much better. A lot of the runtime is spent developing the characters, especially the new ones, because remember, this movie was supposed to come out before the movies for Aquaman, Flash, and Cyborg, and now obviously since then DC's film slate has changed dramatically since the time this movie was filmed, but I still think that the film does a good job introducing us to Aquaman, Flash, and Cyborg for the first time. Cyborg actually has a lot to do with this movie. We learn about his backstory, and we actually learn about his powers and how they work. This stuff is completely ignored in Justice League, and because of those choices, Cyborg was the weakest part of the theatrical cut. He gets a lot of character development in this movie, and he's definitely one of the biggest improvements from the theatrical cut. In my opinion, Flash is decent in this movie. I know a lot of people still don't really like Ezra Miller Flash, but I hope that you'll find some comfort in the fact that he's much better in this movie than he was in the theatrical. He's still the comic relief character in this movie, but he's not constantly throwing out MCU-style quips every few seconds like the theatrical version, and that can actually be said for all the characters because Joss Whedon really messed these characters up a lot because they were all making jokes at the most unnecessary times in that version. I personally still don't love Ezra Miller Flash, but I'm waiting for a new writer and director to tackle his character for the Flashpoint movie. I also think Flash gets one of the coolest scenes in this movie, but I'll talk about that later. Aquaman is so much better in this movie than he was in the theatrical. In Justice League, he was a real dick to a lot of the characters, and it's kind of just left unresolved. But in this movie, he's still kind of a dick at first, but that attitude changes once he starts interacting with the other characters, and we see that he's way more sympathetic. He's still much better in his own movie, but I think he still gets some good stuff here. Now, the returning characters that we've seen before are all much better in this movie than they have been for the past couple movies. Batman is way better than he was in Batman v Superman, and believe it or not, he actually doesn't kill people in this movie. And I actually like that he feels kind of guilty for Superman's death, and I think his motivations for bringing the heroes together is handled much better. Wonder Woman is great to see again, and oh my god, she's brutal in this movie. It's really interesting to see how Zack Snyder and Patty Jenkins both direct Wonder Woman, because in the Wonder Woman movies, Diana's all kind-hearted and she never goes out of her way to kill people, but in the Snyder Cut, Diana's kind of a cold-blooded killer. In her opening scene where she's fighting those terrorists, she slams people into walls and she straight up basically disintegrates their leader. And Diana's role in this movie is kind of bogged down because she's just kind of there to explain the lore of the mother boxes. She still gets some good moments in the movie, and I really like seeing Wonder Woman in the modern day interacting with the other heroes. I think Superman was much better in this movie than he was previously. He's not in the movie a whole lot, but he still gets some awesome moments. I particularly love the scene where he goes into the Kryptonian ship and there's a whole bunch of callbacks to Man of Steel, and it ends with a redone version of Superman's first flight scene. I think one of the more decent improvements in this movie is Steppenwolf. He does get some backstory, but at the end of the day, he's still just the big bad guy that the good guys are supposed to fight and defeat to save the day. Now, Darkseid was really cool. I think he was amazing to see in a movie, and even though he's not in the movie that much, like we see him in this extended flashback scene, and then we get a really cool glimpse into like a potential future, and then we see him through a boom tube on Apocalypse at the very end of the movie. I think he is definitely supposed to have more of a presence in future movies, but I think what we saw of him in this movie was cool enough. Now, the weakest character in these movies, especially the Snyder Cut, is Lois Lane. As much as I like Amy Adams, her character is so pointless in this series. In Batman v Superman and in this movie, we're told that Lois is the key for something really important, and it gets really annoying because her reason for being important is most definitely something that we were supposed to see in a future movie that we'll most likely never see. I think she has a nice reunion scene with Superman, but at the same time, I still think it's really sad that we've had to wait 3 movies to get some good Superman-Lois romance in this series. So, as I said earlier, there are scenes in this movie that are completely different in the theatrical cut, as well as some scenes that weren't included altogether. There are some really good scenes that Joss Whedon just absolutely ruined in the theatrical cut. For example, the scene where the heroes first meet Steppenwolf is completely different in this movie. In the theatrical, the heroes just watch Steppenwolf kill a couple innocent people before they decide to jump in and help. In the Snyder Cut, the heroes jump in almost immediately, and they decide to prioritize the safety of the innocent people before they all decide to attack Steppenwolf. I really love scenes in superhero movies where the superheroes actually save people, because that's what they do. And I'm really happy that Snyder decided to include this sequence in his version. And another thing I mentioned earlier is that Aquaman is a huge dick in the theatrical cut, and that never really got resolved. But in this movie, he actually has some cute character moments. For example, there's a scene in the theatrical, Aquaman is a huge jerk towards Cyborg because he thinks Cyborg is working for the bad guys and he can't control his powers and so he's dangerous. But in the Snyder Cut, his relationship with Cyborg is totally different. In this alternate scene in the Snyder Cut, Aquaman is really sympathetic towards Cyborg, because there's the scene where Cyborg is trying to locate the mother boxes, and Aquaman is all like, we're asking a kid who just lost his father to go up against the most dangerous machines in the universe. And it shows that he really does care for him and other people. And I also like him and Cyborg's combo attack against Steppenwolf. That's something I love a lot in this movie. The heroes actually fight together, unlike the theatrical cut where each of the heroes kind of just fight Steppenwolf one at a time, and then Superman just comes in and finishes them off. Now, I think the coolest scene in this movie, in my opinion, is the end of the final fight. Flash's role in the final battle is to run fast enough to generate a charge that will power up Cyborg enough to enter the mother boxes, but at the end, Flash gets shot and it causes him to fall over, so he can't get to Cyborg in time, and Cyborg can't stop the mother boxes. And as a result, the heroes actually lose. And I really love this scene because we then get this really cool sequence of Flash running back and reversing time to save the day. And I just think this scene is so cool, and it's so much more unique than that really generic fight in the theatrical where the heroes just fight Steppenwolf and he gets teleported back to Apocalypse. Now, the biggest takeaway from all the stuff I just mentioned is that Joss Whedon and Warner Brothers, they actively chose to get rid of all of this amazing stuff that could have saved the theatrical version even a little bit. I think it's so great that we get to see the stuff that we were supposed to see in theaters, and all the stuff that we see in this movie makes Justice League complete and utter garbage. So, the last thing I'm going to talk about from this movie are some of the cool Easter eggs. I think it's awesome that we get to see some Green Lantern teases in the movie. We see one Green Lantern in the flashback scene, and then we actually see Kilowog in that Dark Future sequence. I'm really hoping that we do get some good Green Lantern movie representation soon. I'm not overly excited for the HBO Max series that's in development, and I really wish Warner Brothers wasn't too scared to try new stuff with the Green Lantern property. And the other cool thing about this movie is that we get freaking Martian Manhunter in this movie. He's completely pointless to include, but it's still awesome at the same time that he's here, even if it's only for a couple scenes. And there's stuff in this movie that's there solely for fan service, and Martian Manhunter is the biggest example for that. Superman's black suit also serves no other purpose than fan service as well, because in the comics, the black suit actually has a function. It allows Superman to absorb more solar radiation because he was weaker when he was resurrected in the comics. But in this movie, it's just an aesthetic choice that Snyder decided to make for no reason. And the nightmare scene I thought was alright, but I genuinely see no reason to include it in this movie. It's weird and just comes out of nowhere, and weirdly enough, it's one of the only new things that was filmed for this version of the movie. It's out of place, and while I like finally seeing Batfleck and Jared Leto Joker interacting, I hate that Joker is out of focus for a weirdly long portion of their conversation, and their conversation as a whole is just weird. But I do kind of like that Batman actually kind of rocks Joker to his core for a second when he says, "I'm gonna fucking kill you." But aside from that, the scene as a whole isn't really that important, and since we're most likely never gonna see what this scene and the movie as a whole sets up, I just think it's weird that Zack Snyder even bothered to include the scene in the first place. To close out my thoughts, Zack Snyder's Justice League is good. Sure, it has its problems here and there, but as a whole, I think the wait was well worth it. And whether you love or hate Zack Snyder's DC movies, you can't deny that it is really amazing that Warner Brothers gave him the chance to complete his version of the movie. And I know a lot of people will be turned off by this movie purely because of its insane runtime, and I honestly can't blame them. However, I still definitely recommend this movie. If you love Snyder's DC movies, you will love this. If you really don't like his movies, especially his DC ones, you'll probably still find it mostly unbearable, but I think you'll get some enjoyment out of it. And if you know someone who hasn't seen either version of Justice League yet, I would definitely show them this version because it's superior in almost every conceivable way. And as unlikely as it'll be, if a sequel ever gets made, I will certainly be excited for it. I'm really happy though, because at the end of the day, I do have a cool DC movie that I can watch, and I hope that more people get the same level of enjoyment out of it as I did. I really hope that DC's next few movies are good, because I think general audiences haven't really seen decent representations of some of these characters yet. But at the end of the day, if this movie proves anything, it proves that the power of the fans is real.